The laughter hit before Soren Vale even understood what was happening. 1 second he was standing near the east wall of the Callaway Estate ballroom, badge clipped to his jacket, hands ready, doing his job, invisible the way staff always were at these things. The next second, his name was being read aloud from a folded card, and 200 of the wealthiest alpha donors in the Pacific Northwest turned to look at him like he was the punchline they had been waiting for all night. He felt it before he processed it. That particular kind of cold. The kind that starts in your chest and moves outward. Soren kept his face still. He was good at that. 26 years of navigating a world that was not built for him had given him a certain talent for stillness. For reading rooms before rooms could read him. And right now, this room was reading him the way people read something they found amusing. Something harmless. Something they could throw away after the joke landed. The man at the front of the room, a broad-shouldered alpha named Counselor Desmond Helbrecht, was smiling the smile of someone who had arranged this. Not a surprised smile. A waiting smile. He held the second card up dramatically, letting the silence stretch, and then he read the name on it like he was announcing the winner of something grand. Kedrick Thorne. The room erupted. Not polite laughter. The full-throated, expensive kind. Crystal glasses lifted. Men in $5,000 suits nudging each other. A woman near the fireplace pressing her fingers to her lips like she was trying to hold something back. 3 council members standing near the back bar exchanging looks that were too quick, too knowing to be genuine amusement. Soren had been brought here tonight to interpret for a group of hearing-impaired charitable donors attending the Pacific Northwest Elite Giving Summit. Real work. Legitimate work. He had done this a dozen times. Standing quietly to the side, translating in American Sign Language while board members and council officials gave speeches about their generosity. He was good at his job. He showed up on time, stayed out of the way, and left without anyone remembering his name. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. But someone tonight had changed the arrangement without telling him. He scanned the room fast. 14 cameras he could identify immediately. 3 positioned too high to be security equipment. 2 near the dais at angles that made no sense for event photography. 1 tucked against the far column that had not been there when he arrived at 6:15. Someone was filming this specifically. The laughter kept going. And then the crowd shifted the way crowds shift when something real is about to happen, and Soren saw him for the first time. Kedrick Thorne did not move like other people moved. He walked from the far end of the room with a quietness that did not match his size. 6'3", shoulders that filled the width of a doorframe, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously. The black suit he wore had no tie, no pocket square, no decorative anything. Just clean dark lines and the kind of stillness that came not from training but from something deeper. From not caring what a room full of people thought of him. His eyes moved across the space the way a person scans a room they have already mapped. Not curiosity. Assessment. The crowd parted the way crowds always parted for men like Kedrick Thorne. Not out of courtesy, but out of instinct. The instinct that tells you, without a single word being spoken, that this particular person is not something you step in front of. He stopped a few feet from Soren. The laughter in the room didn't exactly stop. It recalibrated, became uncertain, became the kind of sound people make when they are not sure if the joke is still funny. Kedrick looked at Soren. Not through him, not past him, not at him the way these people had been looking at him all night, like he was a prop. He looked at Soren the way someone looks at another person they are actually seeing. Then his hands moved. Clean, practiced, unhesitating. Do you want to leave? American Sign Language. Precise. Native-level fluency. Not the halting, textbook-slow signing of someone who learned it in a weekend seminar to put on a resume. Real fluency. The kind that only comes from years. Soren's chest did something that he did not have a name for immediately. He had been signing his whole life. He had stood in rooms like this his whole life. He had watched people talk about him, over him, past him, through him for 26 years. No one at this level had ever signed to him like that. Not once. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a room where everyone was laughing at something that was supposed to hurt you, but the one person you expected to make it worse was the only one who asked if you were okay? Drop a comment and tell me what that moment felt like for you. Soren stood completely still. The room was still watching. Halbrecht was still smiling that arranged smile. And Soren's mind was moving faster than it had moved all night, because something was wrong with this picture in a way he could not yet name but could absolutely feel. Kedrick Thorne, Alpha King of the Thorne Syndicate, the most feared name in the Western criminal network, the man 3 different federal investigations had tried and failed to build a case against New Sign Language. Not casually, fluently. And he was using it right now, in front of 200 people, at the exact moment a room full of powerful elites expected him to publicly humiliate a deaf Omega translator who had no political protection, no prominent family, and no way to fight back. Soren's hands started to form a response. He got one letter in. The pairing ceremony will now proceed. Halbrecht's voice cut across the room like a blade. Not an announcement. Command. The cameras repositioned. Every single one of them. And Soren realized, with a clarity that hit him like ice water, that the laughter had never been the point. The cameras had always been the point. Kedrick did not look at Halbrecht. He kept his eyes on Soren, and his expression did not change. Not 1 degree. As the room reshuffled itself around the announcement, guests moving, staff appearing from side doors carrying a ceremonial tray, the event suddenly accelerating towards something that no longer felt like entertainment. His hands moved again, small, controlled, positioned at his side so only Soren could read them from this distance. They want me to refuse you. Soren kept his face neutral, took everything he had, because in the span of 40 seconds, the entire shape of tonight had shifted. This was not a drunk donor's idea of a funny game. The tray being carried toward the dais held a ceremonial pairing box, the kind used in official Omegaverse binding events. That was not something you pulled out of a closet on impulse. Someone had brought this here tonight with a plan already in place. Someone had arranged for his name to be in that drawing. Someone had made sure there were cameras positioned at angles that would capture every second of whatever happened next. Soren had spent his entire professional life reading what people were not saying. He was reading it now. If Kedrick refused the pairing, publicly, on camera, in front of the most politically connected alpha crowd in the Pacific Northwest, the council would have exactly what they needed. An undeniable, recorded moment of the Thorne Alpha King rejecting an Omega citizen. A disabled Omega. On charity night, the scandal would be immediate, coordinated, and devastating. The kind that ends careers. The kind that ends more than careers. Halbrecht was not smiling because this was funny. He was smiling because he thought he had already won. Soren's heart was beating at a rate he was actively trying to manage. His hands stayed still at his sides. He watched Kedrick turn. Not quickly, not reactively, but with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had walked into traps before and always left through the front door, and stepped toward the dais. The room buzzed, confusion moving through the crowd like a current. Halbrecht's smile flickered, just once, just for a second. Then it came back, but it was different now. Tighter, less comfortable. Kedrick picked up the ceremonial ring from the tray without being told to. He turned back toward Soren. The room went so quiet that Soren could feel the absence of sound, which was its own sensation, its own weight when you had lived your whole life inside it. He held out the ring. Not with ceremony. Not with performance. Just held it out and looked at Soren and waited. It was the waiting that broke Soren open. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just a small, interior collapse of something he had been holding up for a very long time. Because powerful men did not wait for Soren Vale. They decided things on his behalf. They spoke over him, around him, for him. They arranged his evenings and his job assignments and his usefulness, and then they forgot his name on the way out. They did not stand in the middle of 200 people and wait for his answer. Soren stepped forward. The ring went on his finger. The room erupted, but differently this time. Not laughter. Shock moving through the crowd in waves, hitting different people at different speeds. Several guests looked genuinely confused. A man near the left wall had his phone out and was typing something rapidly. A council member in a gray suit had stopped pretending to smile entirely. Two of them looked angry. Not annoyed. Not surprised. Angry. The calculated kind. Soren filed that away behind his eyes and kept his expression exactly where it was. Afterward, while the room continued its uncomfortable recalibration and Halbrecht moved to the microphone to say something gracious and meaningless, Kedrick came to stand beside Soren near the east column, close enough to speak, far enough to look casual, and his hands moved low and private between them. Now the real game begins. Soren looked at him. He had approximately 4,000 questions. He had no idea which one to ask first. He had no idea if he was in more danger now than he had been an hour ago, or if the ring on his finger was protection, or if it was something else entirely. Something he did not have language for yet. He chose the most practical question he could find. What happens now? Kedrick glanced toward Halbrecht at the front of the room, then back at Soren. He signed 3 words. Not here. Come. They left through a side corridor. A town car was waiting. Soren got in because he was not sure what else to do, and because something in his gut, the instinct that had kept him alive and functional and employed in a world that had never made space for him, was telling him that whoever had arranged tonight's ceremony had not finished with him yet. The car moved through Portland's waterfront lights. Kedrick sat across from him and let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said it. Not signed. Said it, out loud, quietly, in the back of a moving car on a Tuesday night, and Soren read his lips without effort. You're in danger now. The Thorn townhouse was not what Soren expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected, something aggressive, probably. Sharp edges and security hardware and the kind of decorating that announced itself. But the building on the corner of Northwest Thurman was a converted Victorian with original windows and a reading lamp on in the front room, visible from the street. It looked like a place where someone actually lived. That was somehow more alarming than if it had looked like a fortress. Bastian Thorn was already standing when they walked in. Older than Kedrick by minutes, not years, they were triplets, identical in bone structure, different in everything else. Bastian had the posture of a man who made decisions professionally, the kind of quiet, contained stillness that people mistook for warmth and was actually something much more precise. He looked at Soren the way an architect looks at a building, not appraising it for beauty but assessing it for structural integrity. Riven was in the corner, seated, reading something on a tablet. He looked up when Soren entered and held his gaze for 3 full seconds without blinking, then looked back down. He did not seem rude. He seemed like someone who was recording information. Nobody made introductions. Nobody offered Soren a coffee or told him to make himself comfortable. But nobody treated him like an inconvenience either, and in the specific geography of Soren Vale's experience, that absence was its own form of welcome. Bastian moved to a table near the window, spread several documents across it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation before Soren arrived. We need to know what you observed tonight, he said. He did not look at Kedrick when he said it. He looked at Soren. Soren glanced at Kedrick. Kedrick signed, "Answer him." So Soren answered. He told them about the cameras, the positions, the angles, the timing of when they had repositioned. He told them about the council members he had identified in the crowd and the specific moments each of them had reacted differently than their neighbors. He told them about the pairing box being carried out from a side door before the drawing was finished, which meant it had been staged before the result was announced. He told them everything. Bastian listened without interrupting. Riven had put his tablet down and was watching Soren's hands with the same focused attention Kedrick had shown at the estate, and Soren realized, with a start that he kept entirely internal, that all three of them signed. All three Thorn brothers. Native fluency, each of them, though Riven's was slightly more formal, like someone who had learned it from books alongside someone who already knew it from life. When Soren finished, Bastion was quiet for a moment. Then, "The council has been moving toward this for 8 months. They need Kedrick out of the leadership structure before the spring audit." Riven spoke for the first time. His voice was low and unhurried. "They chose you specifically," he said to Soren. "Not an accusation. A statement of fact that he seemed to find significant. Not randomly. There is no random in a room like that." Soren knew this. He had known it the moment his name was read aloud. What he had not known, what was still settling into him in pieces, each piece heavier than the last, was the full shape of what specifically meant. What it meant that they had selected him. What they had expected his purpose to be. Bastion pulled a folder from the bottom of the stack. He opened it to a photograph, grainy, surveillance quality, of the Callaway Estate East Corridor. Taken from above. The timestamp read 6:42 p.m. Soren had arrived at 6:15. In the photograph, someone was installing a device to the underside of the east wall decorative molding. The spot Soren had stood beside for 3 hours, waiting for his shift to begin. His throat went tight. Riven pulled the tablet back up, turned it so Soren could see the screen. Hidden camera footage from inside the ballroom. Cleaner quality than the still photograph. A fixed angle that covered the full east wall. Covered exactly where Soren had been standing. All night. Riven said, quietly, "Someone was watching you before the drawing. Not after. Before." Soren looked at the footage on the screen. At his own image standing against that wall for 3 hours. Being observed. Being studied. Being decided about. And the cold in his chest, the one that had arrived when the laughter started, went down another 10 degrees. Riven set the tablet on the table between them without saying anything else. And on the screen, frozen in the last frame of the footage, was a second figure. Standing behind Soren. Watching him. Someone Soren had never seen before in his life. They let him sleep in a guest room on the second floor. Soren did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and watched the ceiling and let his mind do what it did best, which was arrange scattered information into patterns until the shape of a thing became clear. He had always been good at this. He had been doing it since he was 7 years old and realized that the hearing world communicated in layers, what people said, what they meant, what they were afraid of, and what they wanted, and that reading all 4 layers at once was the only way to stay ahead. He was reading all 4 layers now. By 3 in the morning, the pattern was clear. He had not been selected because of Kedrick. He had been selected because of himself. A deaf Omega. No immediate family in the state. No alpha sponsor. No political relationship with any council member or any advocacy organization with real funding behind it. No one who would make noise if something happened to him. No one who would push back. No one who would make the kind of problem that required effort to manage. Ideal collateral damage. The plan had an elegant brutality to it, the kind that only looked complicated from the outside. Step 1. Plant Soren near Kedrick during a public, camera-documented pairing ceremony. Step 2. Let the footage circulate. Either Kedrick refuses and loses his position over the Omega discrimination angle, or Kedrick accepts and suddenly he has a politically inconvenient marriage that the council can weaponize however they need later. Step 3. Whenever convenient, produce documentation that the pairing was arranged by Kedrick to manufacture public sympathy, using a disabled Omega as political theater. Exploitation scandal. Leadership collapse. Clean removal. In every version of this plan, Soren's role was the same. He was the instrument, not the target. You did not worry about what happened to an instrument after you were done using it. That was the part that sat in the center of his chest at 3 in the morning and did not move. He got up at 5 and went downstairs. Bastion was already at the table. He had coffee made and a second mug placed on the opposite side of the table before Soren reached the bottom step, which told Soren something about Bastian Thorn that he stored away carefully. They sat across from each other. Bastian opened a laptop and turned it so Soren could see the screen. Financial records, routing numbers, organization names. The Pacific Northwest Alpha Council runs 17 registered charitable organizations, Bastian said. He spoke at a pace and with a clarity of lip movement that Soren suspected was intentional. Deliberate. Practiced. 14 of them have filed tax-exempt status in the last 4 years. 3 of them are operational. Soren leaned forward to read the screen. The inactive organizations had names that sounded purposeful. Omega Futures Initiative, Pacific Shelter Coalition, Northwest Transition Support Services. He looked at the financial columns. Looked again. Millions, he signed. Not a question. 14 million across the 3 inactive shells in the last fiscal year alone, Bastian said. He tapped the routing column. Moving through 6 different financial institutions. Always in amounts just under federal reporting thresholds. Always timed to coincide with council fiscal quarters. Soren looked at the organization names again. Omega Charities. Millions of dollars moving through Omega Charities that were not actually running programs. Not actually sheltering anyone. Not actually serving anyone. Bastian let him look. Let him process. Did not rush him or explain what he should be thinking, which was the other thing Soren filed away carefully about Bastian Thorn. Then Bastian clicked to a second document. An internal memo. Council letterhead. Dated 3 weeks ago. Soren read it. Read it again. His hands stayed still in his lap and his face did not change, but something behind his eyes went very, very quiet. The memo referenced an upcoming audit. The same spring audit Bastian had mentioned last night. It referenced the need to restructure leadership prior to external review. It referenced, in careful and deliberately vague language, the need to resolve the Thorn obstacle through legitimate political mechanism before the March window. And in the final paragraph, almost as a footnote, it referenced a separate initiative. A data collection and asset transfer program involving Omega citizens in 3 Pacific Northwest counties. The memo did not use the word trafficking. It did not need to. Soren had spent his career interpreting the space between what people said and what they meant. He knew exactly what the footnote said. Bastian closed the laptop slowly. We believe the financial laundering is the visible layer, he said. He looked at Soren steadily. We believe the charitable shell organizations are the mechanism for something larger. Something that has been running for longer than the financial records show. Soren looked at him. How much longer? He signed. Bastian paused. Not because he did not know the answer. Because he was deciding how much of the answer to give. Long enough, he said finally. That the council has been very careful about which Omega citizens get close to the documentation. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Soren looked at the closed laptop. Thought about the shell organizations with their careful Omega-specific names. Thought about the memo's footnote. Thought about himself, no family, no alpha sponsor, no political protection. Standing against that east wall for 3 hours while someone studied him from behind. They selected me for the prank, he signed slowly, because I had no one who would ask questions. Bastian met his eyes. Yes, he said. Soren nodded once. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked back up. Show me everything. Bastian did. It took 4 hours and a second pot of coffee and a whiteboard that Riven materialized from somewhere on the 3rd floor, and by the time they were done the surface of it was covered in names and dates and organization codes that Soren had committed to memory with the systematic precision of someone who had spent his whole life recording things he could not trust to paper. He was good at patterns. He was very good at encrypted patterns. He was, though he had never said this to anyone, never put it in a bio or a professional summary, extraordinarily good at the kind of interpretive reading that happened below the surface of language. The council communications that Bastion had obtained moved through 4 different encoding layers, each designed to look like standard financial correspondence to anyone not reading the full sequence. Most people would have seen budget summaries and committee updates. Soren saw the second conversation running underneath. He worked through it methodically. Bastion sat beside him, close enough to watch the process without crowding it. Riven appeared at intervals to drop additional files on the table and disappear again. Kedrick came down at mid-morning, read the whiteboard without asking questions, poured himself a coffee, and sat in the chair near the window to watch Soren work. Nobody hovered. Nobody explained what he should be finding. Nobody made a single comment about how long it was taking or whether he was sure about his reads. Soren had been in professional environments his whole adult life. He knew what it felt like to be tolerated. He knew what it felt like to be accommodated, which was different and in some ways worse, because accommodation always came with that specific texture of patience that was actually impatience wearing better clothes. This was neither of those things. This felt, and he turned the word over carefully because he did not use it loosely, like respect. Not for what he was, for what he could do. By noon, he had decoded enough of the communication sequence to confirm Bastion's suspicion about the shell organizations. The laundering was real and it was significant, but it was not the primary function of the network. The primary function was coordination. The organizations provided cover for a logistics system, scheduling, transport documentation, identity management, that had nothing to do with legitimate Omega services. He stopped on one document. Read it twice. His hands were very still. "This is a list," he signed. Bastion leaned in. Soren pointed to the column that ran down the right side of the encoded document. Names, not clearly formatted, blended into what appeared to be a volunteer coordination roster for one of the shell charities. But they were not volunteers. The column had collection dates beside each name. Not donation dates. Not intake dates. Collection dates. Riven appeared in the doorway. Soren did not look up. He was reading the list. He was reading the list because something had snagged in the lower part of his vision, the way something snags when your eyes recognize a thing before your conscious mind does. He scrolled up. Read the encoding key he had reconstructed earlier in the morning. Applied it to the name column. His fingers went cold. He applied the key again. The same result. Third name from the bottom of the current page. Vale S. Intake window March 14th to 21st. Soren sat back in the chair. The room was very quiet. Riven came to stand beside him. Looked at the screen. Looked at the name. His face did not move, but something in his jaw shifted barely once, and then he turned and walked out of the kitchen without a word. A moment later Soren heard him, quietly and very clearly, say Kedrick's name from the hallway. Soren looked at the list, at his name, at the collection window that started in 11 days. He had known, from the moment his name was read aloud at the Calloway estate, that tonight had not been random. He had known, by 3 in the morning, that he had been chosen for his lack of protection. He had known, sitting across from Bastion at 5 a.m. with financial documents spread between them, that whatever was running underneath the council's charitable organizations was not charitable. He had known all of that, but knowing the shape of a danger and seeing your own name written inside it were two entirely different things. Kedrick walked into the kitchen. He looked at the screen. His hands moved. "You're not on this list anymore." Soren looked at him. He did not know if that was a fact or a promise. He did not know yet if there was a difference when it came to Kedrick Thorne. What he knew was that there were 11 days. And somewhere in those encoded documents there were more names. And he had not finished reading. Halbrecht chose a waterfront cafe. That was the first thing Soren noticed. Not a council office. Not anywhere with security cameras that someone else controlled. A small place on the Willamette with outdoor seating and enough ambient noise from the water that no recording equipment would pick up clean audio. He had chosen this location the way a careful man chooses everything. Deliberately. Soren arrived 3 minutes early and sat with his back to the wall, which gave him a clear line of sight to every entry point and a direct view of anyone approaching from the dock. He ordered a coffee he did not intend to drink and waited. Halbrecht arrived exactly on time. He was not what Soren expected in the daylight. At the gala he had been a presence, elevated platform, expensive suit, the kind of man who moved through rooms like he owned the air in them. Here, in a weathered outdoor chair across a small table, he looked like someone's grandfather. Silver-haired, measured, the kind of face that people in the city trusted with their charitable donations and their political endorsements. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He sat down without greeting Soren, looked at the water for a moment, then looked at Soren with the particular expression of a man who has decided that the conversation he is about to have is, ultimately, a courtesy. "You're a smart young man," he said. He spoke slowly, precisely, the way people sometimes spoke to Soren when they wanted him to understand something, which meant he either knew about the deafness or had been told. Another careful choice. "I've read your file," Halbrecht continued. "You've built something real for yourself. Real work. Honest work. You have a good reputation." He paused. "Let that sit. You should protect it," he said. Soren kept his hands on the table. Visible. Still. He had learned, over many years, that keeping his hands visible in a conversation was its own kind of statement. It told people watching from a distance that he was listening, that he was compliant, that he was not preparing a response. People who wanted to control conversations loved visible, still hands. They found them reassuring. He needed Halbrecht reassured right now. "What I'd like to propose," Halbrecht said, "is very simple. You've found yourself in an uncomfortable position through no fault of your own. That can be resolved. The pairing arrangement, which we both understand was not entered into under ideal circumstances, can be quietly dissolved. No scandal, no press. You return to your life. We ensure your contract work continues. We make sure the right people know your name for the right reasons." He folded his hands on the table. "All we need from you is a brief statement, privately made, to the council, that the pairing was initiated under pressure from the Thorn organization, that you felt you had no choice." Soren looked at him. He did not move his hands. He was reading Halbrecht's face the way he read every face. Not just the words, but the timing of the words, the micro-movements around the eyes and jaw that preceded and followed each sentence. The things people revealed in the space between what they said and when they said it. What he read was this: Halbrecht was not afraid. He was annoyed. There was a difference, and it mattered. Fear would have made this offer larger. More money, more protection, more reassurance. Annoyance meant Halbrecht still believed this was a problem with a simple solution. That Soren was still the simple part of this equation. That the ring on his finger was an inconvenience rather than a complication. He had not yet adjusted his assessment of Soren Vale. Good. Soren let the silence run for a moment. Long enough to look like he was considering it. Long enough to be polite. Then he picked up his coffee and took a sip and looked out at the water, and when he looked back at Halbrecht, he signed his response slowly, clearly, so that there was no possible misreading. "I'll need time to think about it." Halbrecht studied him. "Of course," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a card on the table between them. Then he leaned forward. Just slightly. His voice stayed the same. Calm. Grandfatherly. Warm in the specific way of a man who had practiced warmth until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Accidents happen to people without powerful families. He said it the same way he had said everything else. Like a courtesy. Like a kindness. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked back toward the dock without looking back. Unhurried. Certain. The walk of a man who was not worried about the answer. Soren sat at the table. The card between them had a council seal on it and a private number handwritten in ink that did not bleed. He left it there. He looked at the water. He thought about 11 days. He thought about his name on a list with a collection window. Then he stood up, left the coffee, and walked back to the car where Riven was waiting at the curb, parked legally, reading something on his phone. Riven looked up, looked at Soren's face, did not ask what happened. He already knew. Kedrick was waiting when they got back. He was standing in the front room with his jacket off, sleeves pushed up, looking at the whiteboard Riven had brought down from the 3rd floor. The same whiteboard Soren had been writing on for 4 hours that morning. He had added to it 3 new columns down the right side in handwriting that was smaller than Soren's and marginally less organized. He turned when Soren came through the door. Read his face the same way Riven had. Did not ask what Halbrecht said. Instead he went to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water and set it on the table near where Soren was pulling off his jacket, and then he went back to the whiteboard and pointed to the new column on the right. Bastian found 2 more shell accounts this morning, he said, speaking clearly. His mouth angled so Soren had a clean line for lip reading. The trafficking network is larger than the council records show. It runs into 2 neighboring states. Soren sat down. He drank the water. He looked at the whiteboard. He was not ready to talk about Halbrecht yet. What Halbrecht had said, the last thing, the quiet one, the one delivered with the warmth of a man offering directions, was sitting in the center of his chest, and he needed a minute before he put it into the room. He looked at the new columns. Read the account numbers and the state codes. Oregon, Washington, Idaho. He thought about the list, about his name, about collection windows and logistics systems and an organization designed to move human beings the way other organizations moved money, quietly in amounts that stayed beneath thresholds, timed to fiscal quarters when scrutiny moved elsewhere. He thought about himself at 22, taking his first interpreting contract, proud of it, proud of being useful in a world that had spent a long time making him feel like a liability. He thought about building a reputation the way you build a wall in winter, 1 stone at a time against wind without anyone watching. He thought about Halbrecht sitting across from him and using that reputation as a lever. And then something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly. It just shifted, the way a door shifts when it has been deciding for a while and finally picks a direction. He looked at Kedrick. Why did you really marry me? He signed it clearly, directly. The question he had been carrying since the car ride from Callaway Estate, since the ring went on his finger, since Kedrick had stood in the middle of 200 people and waited for Soren's answer like the answer actually mattered. Kedrick turned from the whiteboard. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone constructing a lie. The quiet of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. Because I needed someone the council underestimated, he said. Soren looked at him. That was an honest answer. It was also incomplete, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed it further right now, because the incomplete honest answer was more useful than a complete answer that neither of them was ready for yet. Soren nodded once. Then he put his hands on the table and signed everything Halbrecht had said, word for word, in the exact order it was delivered, including the last line. Kedrick's face did not change. That was the part that stayed with Soren afterward. No anger, no reaction, just a small, internal adjustment behind his eyes, the kind you make when someone has confirmed information you already suspected but had not yet verified. He turned back to the whiteboard. He picked up the marker. He added 1 line to the bottom of the right column. Then he set the marker down and looked at Soren with an expression that Soren could not fully read, and he could read almost everything. We're not waiting for the council to make the next move, Kedrick said. He crossed to the table and sat down across from Soren, and for the first time since the estate, they were at the same level, eye to eye, the whiteboard and the documents and the weight of all of it spread between them. I need to know if you're in this, Kedrick said. Not protected by it. Not adjacent to it. In it. Soren looked at the table. Thought about 11 days. Thought about his name on a list with 37 others. Thought about a Def Omega boy who had learned to read rooms before rooms could read him, and what that skill was worth in the hands of people who actually intended to use it. He looked up. "Show me the plan," he signed, and Kedrick reached across the table and turned the laptop to face him. On the screen was a council meeting invitation. Private, encrypted, scheduled for Thursday evening at a waterfront property in southwest Portland. 48 hours from now. The attendee list had 14 names. 4 of them were federal senators. Thursday arrived cold and gray, the way Portland days arrived in late winter. Without announcement, without apology, just low clouds and the smell of the river cutting through everything. The property in southwest Portland was registered to a holding company that traced back, through 3 layers of subsidiary ownership, to one of the Shell charitable organizations Soren had decoded 4 days earlier. A 2-story waterfront building that appeared on public records as a leased event space. No residential designation. No commercial signage. Nobody was supposed to know what happened inside it on Thursday evenings. Bastian had located the property through the financial records. Riven had spent 48 hours on the building schematics. Kedrick had made 3 phone calls that Soren was not privy to and which resulted, without explanation, in a utility access panel on the building's south side being unlocked from the inside at precisely 7:45 p.m. Soren did not ask how. He was learning which questions to hold. They entered through the south panel at 7:52. Soren, Kedrick, Riven. Bastian stayed outside with a vehicle and a comm line and the kind of controlled comm that Soren was starting to recognize as Bastian's factory setting. Not the absence of feeling but the deliberate management of it. The building's interior was larger than the exterior suggested. A main floor event room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river. A mezzanine level above, accessible by a staircase on the north wall. The meeting was in the main event room. Soren could see the light from beneath the door to the east corridor. 14 voices in there. He could not hear them. He did not need to. They moved to the mezzanine level. Riven found a position at the northeast corner that gave Soren a clear sight line to the event room through the interior window panel. Glass, floor to ceiling, originally designed to let the mezzanine overlook the main floor during large events. It was dark on the mezzanine. The meeting room below was lit. Soren pressed himself to the glass and started reading. Lip reading at distance was not the same as lip reading in a direct conversation. Distance changed angle. Angle changed accuracy. You compensated with context, you learned the rhythm of what people were discussing, and you used that rhythm to fill gaps the distance created. You could not get every word. You got enough. He got enough. Halbrecht was at the head of the table. 6 council members on his left. 6 on his right. 2 men standing near the back wall who were not seated, staff security, both facing outward. One of the standing men Soren did not recognize. The other was a face he had seen in a newspaper photograph 2 weeks ago. Federal Senator Devin Marquette, 3rd-term incumbent, senior member of the Pacific Northwest Oversight Committee. Soren filed that away and kept reading. Halbrecht was directing the meeting. Soren caught phrases in sequence, timeline, asset relocation, the audit window, and filled the gaps with the decoding framework he had built from the Shell organization documents. They were discussing the trafficking operation directly. No code, no careful language, because they believed this room was private, because nobody had ever gotten into this room before. Soren signed continuously to Kedrick, who stood at his shoulder and watched his hands in the low light, relaying each relay to Riven, who was recording everything. Not audio, which would be inadmissible and incomplete, but visual documentation of Soren's interpretation, time-stamped, synchronized to the meeting attendee record they had already pulled. 40 minutes in, the conversation shifted. Soren went very still. New intake window. March. 12 units. Southwest transfer point before federal census. 12 units. Not 12 items. 12 people. He kept his hands moving because stopping would mean Kedrick felt the change, and right now he needed Kedrick receiving, not reacting. Documentation prepared. Compliance from 3 regional law enforcement contacts. 3 law enforcement contacts. He pushed through it. 20 minutes later, Halbrecht moved to the final item on the meeting agenda. And Soren's hands slowed, then stopped, because what Halbrecht was saying now was not about the trafficking network. It was about Kedrick. It was about a contingency plan, specific, documented, already in motion, that did not involve scandal or political removal. Kedrick touched Soren's shoulder. "What are you seeing?" Soren turned from the glass. He looked at Kedrick. He signed it clearly because there was no version of this where softening it was an option, and Kedrick was not someone who needed softening. "They're not trying to remove you from leadership." He paused. "They're planning to remove you permanently." The look on Kedrick's face lasted exactly 1 second. Then it was gone, replaced by the same stillness that had walked through the Callaway Estate ballroom and stood before 200 people and waited for an answer. He looked through the glass at Halbrecht. His jaw moved once. He took out his phone. He called Bastian. 1 word. Now. The federal investigators arrived in 12 minutes. That was the part nobody in that meeting room had planned for. The call had been made, not by Bastian, who was managing the vehicle and the exit, but by a third party Kedrick had briefed 3 days earlier. A contact inside the Department of Justice whose name Soren still did not know and had decided not to ask about. The kind of contact that existed in a world Soren had never been part of before last Tuesday, when his name was read aloud from a folded card and a room full of people laughed. That felt like a different life. For vehicles. Unmarked. They came from the north and east simultaneously, blocking the building's 2 primary exit points before anyone inside had finished reacting to the sound of them on the gravel outside. 2 federal agents and 1 state investigator entered through the front. A second team covered the Riverside exit. Soren watched from the mezzanine until Kedrick touched his arm and directed him toward the south utility corridor and back out through the panel they had entered. Clean exit. Planned. Outside, the air was cold and still smelled like the river. Bastian had the vehicle running. They drove north. Nobody spoke for the first several minutes. Riven sat beside Soren in the back seat and looked out the window. Kedrick was in the front, his phone in his hand, watching the screen without touching it. Soren looked out the opposite window. He was thinking about 12 people. The new intake window. March. Southwest transfer point. The federal investigation now beginning in a waterfront building behind them would take time. Investigations always took time. Evidence was collected, processed, verified. Attorneys were involved. Warrants were issued and challenged and reissued. It was a slow and deliberate machine. And the counsel had moved quickly before. He tapped Riven's arm. Riven looked at him. "The list," Soren signed. "The intake document. The 37 names." Riven held his gaze. "Already sent," he said, quietly. "To the investigator. Before we went in." Soren looked at him. He had not known that. He sat with it for a moment. Then he nodded. The vehicle moved north through Portland, the city lights sliding past the window in long wet streaks, and Soren thought about the specific mathematics of what had just happened. A meeting that was never supposed to be witnessed. A conversation in a private room that was supposed to stay private. A man at the head of a table making plans for 12 people who had no idea their names were on a document in a shell organization's records. And a deaf Omega translator from the east wall of a charity gala who had read every word of it from 40 feet away through a glass panel in the dark. That mattered. He let himself know that it mattered. The next 72 hours were not quiet. Halbrecht was taken into federal custody before midnight Thursday. Council members attempted to access the Shell organization accounts Friday morning and found them frozen. 3 of the law enforcement contacts named in the meeting were placed on administrative leave before noon. By Friday evening, 2 national news outlets were running partial stories based on documentation leaked through a federal press office. Senator Marquette issued a statement Friday afternoon. By Friday night, he had retained a criminal defense attorney and stopped issuing statements. Saturday brought more investigators, more warrants, more names. And then Saturday evening, a car came for Soren. Not a threat, a summons. From the federal investigator's office. They needed him to provide a formal witness account of what he had interpreted Thursday night. Not recorded secondhand. Directly. His testimony. His interpretation. His eyes on Halbrecht's mouth for 60 minutes in a darkened mezzanine. Soren sat in the back seat of that car. He thought about being 22 and proud of his first contract. He thought about his name on a list. He thought about a question he had asked Kedrick 2 days ago and an answer that was honest but incomplete. He thought about Kedrick standing in the middle of 200 people and waiting. When the car stopped outside the federal building, Soren straightened his jacket. He got out. He walked through the front door without breaking stride, because whatever came next, he had already decided he was not leaving through the back. But when he reached the 3rd floor and the investigator's office door opened from the inside, the person standing there was not anyone Soren recognized. And the expression on their face was not the expression of someone who had called him here to help. The person in the doorway was a woman in her early 50s. Short, precise. The kind of person who had learned to take up less space in rooms and had decided at some point to stop doing that. She wore a federal identification badge on a lanyard, Dr. Amar Delacroix, DOJ Victim Services, and she looked at Soren the way people looked at someone they had been waiting for specifically. Not with the measuring look of threat. With the look of someone who had been carrying something they needed to put down. "Come in," she said. She stepped back from the door. "I wanted to speak with you before the formal deposition. Alone." Soren came in. The room was a standard federal office. A table, chairs, a window facing the building's interior courtyard. Dr. Delacroix sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and was quiet for a moment, like someone choosing their first word carefully. Then she signed, "I want to ask how you are doing." Soren looked at her. His hands moved slowly. "You sign." "Yes," she signed back. "For 30 years. My daughter is deaf." He sat with that. In 37 years of life, the number of people who had asked Soren Vale how he was doing, not as courtesy, not as preamble, but as the actual question, was a number he could count without running out of fingers. "I'm all right," he signed. She nodded, did not push it, did not make a production of the grace she was showing him. "The deposition will take approximately 2 hours," she said, speaking now, slower than necessary, clearly. "Your testimony regarding the interpreted content from Thursday's meeting is the cornerstone of the formal case against 9 of the 14 attendees. That includes Counselor Halbrecht. That includes Senator Marquette." She paused. "Your interpretation, your specific testimony, will be the thing that holds." Soren looked at the courtyard window. He thought about the east wall of the Callaway estate. Standing there for 3 hours while someone studied him from behind. Being selected because he had no one to ask questions. They had chosen him because he was the safest person to use. They had not calculated what happened when the safest person to use decided to use himself. The deposition was long and detailed and careful. Dr. Delacroix's team worked with a certified ASL interpreter for the official record. Soren had opinions about the interpreter's fluency. The work was competent, not excellent, but this was not the moment for that particular conversation. He told them everything he had read, in sequence, with the timestamps Riven had synchronized, with the specific phrases and their context and the gaps he had filled with the document framework and where his interpretation was certain versus where it was probable. He was precise, meticulous. He had been meticulous his whole life. It was the skill that had kept him employed and trusted and useful in a world that had spent considerable energy communicating that he was none of those things by default. He walked out of the federal building at 11:40 p.m. Kedrick was outside, leaning against a car, arms crossed, looking at the sky in the specific way of someone who had been outside for a long time and was not going to mention it. Soren stopped in front of him. "You didn't have to wait," he signed. "I know," Kedrick said. They stood there for a moment. Portland at midnight was its own kind of quiet. Not empty, but settled. The river somewhere to the west doing what rivers did. The streetlights making everything amber and ordinary. "There's something I should tell you," Kedrick said. Soren waited. Kedrick looked at the sky for one more second. Then at Soren. 8 years ago, he said, "my cousin disappeared. His name was Emery. He was 20. Deaf. No alpha sponsor. No political connections." He paused. "The council told my family it was a runaway case. Insufficient evidence to investigate." He stopped. His jaw moved once. "I spent 4 years trying to prove they covered it up. I never got far enough. Not until the Shell organization documents gave us the framework. Not until I understood what the charitable networks were actually doing." He looked at Soren steadily. Emery's name was in the archive records. An earlier intake list. From 7 years ago. Soren stood very still. "Thursday night," Kedrick said. "When they named 12 new people, when you signed that to me, I recognized the collection method. The same timing. The same regional routing. The same system that took him." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I chose you at the gala because you were the person the council underestimated," he said. "That was true. But I also chose you because you were standing against that east wall alone, and I recognized what that looked like. I recognized the math of it. Person without protection. Room full of people who were not worried about them." He stopped. "I was not going to be the room." Soren looked at him for a long time. Then his hands moved. Slowly, carefully. "Did they find him?" Kedrick met his eyes. "The archive records from the intake list are part of the federal case now," he said. Dr. Delacroix's team is tracing all historic cases through the network documentation. It will take time." He paused. "But they have the list. And Emery is on it." Soren nodded. He looked at the streetlights, at the amber ordinary quiet of Portland at midnight, at the river smell coming in from the west. He thought about the night they put his name on a list. He thought about the night they stood him up in front of a room full of laughter as an instrument. He thought about the ring on his finger and the whiteboard on the 3rd floor and a federal case now running through 9 former council members, 1 sitting senator, 3 law enforcement officials, and a shell organization network that had believed for years that the people it targeted were too isolated to fight back. He thought about Emery. He thought about 37 names. He thought about 12 more. And then he thought about something he had never let himself think about directly. The specific, quiet, furious truth of it, which was that the world had spent a very long time betting on his silence. And it had gotten the math completely wrong. For months later, Soren stood at a podium at a national conference on Omega Civil Protections in Seattle. His ASL interpreter stood to his left. The room held 300 people. Several of them were legislators. Several were advocates. Several were federal investigators who had worked the case. Several were people who had been on lists, people who were here because the network had been dismantled before the March window closed. He had been asked to speak for 15 minutes. He spoke for 32. He told the truth. All of it. From the east wall of a charity gala to a mezzanine window in a darkened building on a Thursday night in February. He did not make it elegant. He did not make it simple. He told it the way it had happened. Messy, terrifying, real. Because the people in this room deserved the real version. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Afterward, in a hallway outside the main conference room, Kedrick was waiting. He was always waiting now, which was a thing Soren had stopped questioning. And he said nothing, which was also a thing Soren had stopped questioning. Soren leaned against the wall beside him. They stood together for a minute in the kind of quiet that did not need to be filled. Then Soren looked at him, and he signed, slowly, the sentence that had been sitting in him since the night they put a ring on his finger in a room full of laughter. The night they tried to make me disappear. He paused. Was the night their entire empire ran out of time. Kedrick looked at him, and for the first time since Soren had known him, since the estate, since the townhouse, since the mezzanine, since the federal building steps at midnight, the stillness in his face broke open. Just slightly, just enough to let something through that was warmer than calculation and quieter than relief. He signed back. 2 words. Thank you. And Soren understood, completely without gaps, exactly what Kedrick meant. Not for the testimony. Not for the deposition. Not for Thursday night. For Emery. This story is for every person who was counted on to stay quiet. Every person selected because someone decided they had no one in their corner. Every person who was underestimated. The world makes a very specific kind of mistake when it bets against the people it ignores. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt true to something you have lived or witnessed, drop a comment and let the community know. Your words matter here. This channel exists because of stories like this one, and because of viewers like you who show up and share and refuse to look away. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Every week this channel brings you stories that challenge, inspire, and refuse to be quiet, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The conversation does not stop here.